I'm so sorry. I hate time. You know, when it happens. I hate it when it does that. Anyway, there was this game. It was made in the past, and I remember it. You know what that means? It means I have to spend a disgusting amount of time vomiting up all of my unsolicited opinions from the depths of my rotted brain, for no good reason, publicly onto YouTube. For 2 hours. And this is not even the end of it. I could make a part 2 if I wanted to. I'm not joking, this is a threat. It was a small indie horror game from back in 2014. That doesn't narrow it down at all, but you know the one I'm talking about. The furry flash game. The one that started all of this cringedom. The one that still, to this day, is oversaturated on YouTube, and has been for a full decade. And one that I never personally found very scary. I like it. But I also kinda hate it. As you could gather from the timecode, it's not that simple. My feelings are very complicated and nuanced and very interesting, I swear. See, kids? You listening? It all started back in the good old days of 2014, when the funniest shit on the internet was this fucking dog, and memes never peaked again. This man, named Mark I. Player, aka Off-Brand PewDiePie, posted an inconspicuous little video about just another little indie horror game and doomed the internet for eternity. Okay, I'm not gonna give you a whole unnecessary history lesson explaining things you already know, even though it says I have to do that in the YouTuber playbook. But basically, these were simpler times, and the indie horror, and by extension YouTube Let's Play, landscape was completely slightly different ever since. It's still like this to a degree, but especially back then, most horror games fell into the shitty copy of Slender/Amnesia subgenre, and or the glorified proof of concept demo subgenre. There was a lot of first person running and hiding from monsters with no way to fight back, and a bunch of random ass jump scares mixed in for measure.
Kind of looked like a giant version of the Minions from Despicable Me and painted black.
But then, FNAF was invented by Mr. Scott Fnaffington, and he's all like, actually, who needs to move in horror games? You just click buttons and stare at pre-rendered PNGs. And then everyone was like, no waying. And then he was like, Chuck E. Cheese is fucked up, bruh. And everyone went, I'm gonna make 2 bajillion videos about this. And then that went on for several years. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of it, but it changed everything forever. I'm only half/S. The first game did stand out. It's crazy how nobody used animatronics in horror before this, nor was there really anything that prominently used security cameras, at least as the main mechanic. Both are concepts that feel super obvious for horror, and yet somehow this guy was the first. I guess we were all too busy making Slender 15 quintillion times over. The guy deserves some credit for not only utilizing these unique concepts pretty well, but both together. Not only was the gameplay unique, but there was this quirky sense of humor to it, what with the phone calls. And of course, the giant can of worms in the room that is the Easter eggs, but fuck talking about that right now. Though not super impressive when compared to anything with a budget, there's a lot I actually sincerely appreciate about the first Five Nights at Freddy's. Judging it by itself, devoid of the surrounding hype, forgetting about what it would evolve into, and comparing it to only the indie horror games at the time, I think it's a cute little experimental indie game with a good atmosphere and some genuinely novel design and concepts. The premise is straight up great, but the final game is probably the most minimal possible execution of it. The mechanics do a good job of inducing anxiety in most players, but that tension wears off around the halfway point. It's nothing great, but it's aight. Don't tell the fans I said that first part though. I like how overall dreamlike the game feels. What with the ghostly droning ambience and desaturated purplish colors. The colors and lighting are very nice in this one. The almost random harsh reds and blues in the office. Most of the renders have this desaturated purple or bluish hue. It gives the whole game this nice stylized consistency. And there's this weird green colored fog you see in some of the areas. Why is there fog inside this tiny building? Why is it green? Asbestos? It's also very exaggerated, dare I say, almost cartoony in its visual design. Not like that. I mean how hyperbolic the dinginess of the environment is. It's definitely not realistic. Random, nondescript paper and general junk strewn about. Way too many 90s looking ass monitors thrown around the office. What are these receipt looking asses pinned to the wall here? Why are there so many? The fuck is this miscellaneous metallic mesh hanging from the ceiling? Are these the chemicals they put in the food to make the kids gay? Just the fact fact that these big-ass doors exist at all is pretty goofy. Wires hanging from inexplicable places in the ceiling. Leak stains from some mysterious substance on the walls, some of which are leaking upwards. Fucking cobwebs. I mean, who the fuck would go here at all, let alone take their kids? I wouldn't want to eat food from this place. Ain't no way this shit meets health codes. I get the place is on its last legs, in story, and is about to close for this very reason, but this shit looks like it's already been closed for some time. Maybe that's because it is. Or maybe that's because it's a dream. Man, remember when you could ponder stuff like that? Simpler times. If not meant to literally be a dream, all of this contributes to that kind of vibe. And I think stuff like this contributed to the game's overall unique vibe. Okay, but like, what do you do in this game? Well, Scott took our legs, so we can't move. Can't have shit. Instead, you move your cursor around and click some buttons, and some might call this simplistic. But once again, I think it's fine, Your Honor. Yeah, I'm even gonna defend the gameplay. Sure, you can reduce it to just clicking buttons and then waiting for still images to change, but I don't remember reading in the rulebook that you can't make a game like this. And horror games are often not too mechanically complicated. And yes, people can, and apparently have, found this game at least a little scary. Not something I can relate to, since despite being a pussy, I don't remember ever being actually scared by this game. But I wouldn't doubt that some people, like perhaps Markiplier, as a random obscure example, actually found it scary at some point. In an excess of generosity, I'll assume there's a reason for that, outside of the scapegoat of jump scares, or writing it off as all overreactions. In Mark's first video, he doesn't even come across a jump scare until 16 minutes into the just under 18-minute video. That's right, no jump scares even happen until 88% of the way into Mark's first FNAF video. None during the entire first night. Nevertheless, throughout the entire video, he's overreacting just as much as ever, even without jump scares. What's up with that? Well, assuming he's not just faking, here's what I think. When you first drop into the game, especially back then, this type of gameplay was unfamiliar, and it drops you right into it, giving little introduction. And the precious little information you do get is largely misinformation spread by an unhelpful schizo over the phone.
Get a bit quirky at night.
So you're forced to figure out what to do on the fly, which can be naturally pretty anxiety-inducing, and the heavy atmosphere and random noises in the background are disconcerting, as well as those spicy random events, of course. It keeps you on edge for at least the first half, the first time you play. Much of horror in games is based on not completely understanding how the enemy works, and imagining that nearly anything could happen. Or, in particular, imagining your personal worst fears happening, that you overlay on top of the actual experience. In early game FNAF, you're left with only defenses, and not only is there no offense against the enemies, you can't even avoid or hide from them, and your only sense of safety, the doors and even cameras, are limited resources you can only use so much. You're forced to simply observe as the enemies decide how to behave, and oh no, they're getting quirky at night. This basically forces you into a state of reaction rather than proaction, where you're constantly flipping through the cameras to understand what's going on, in desperation to feel some sense of security, without being able to predict anything. You're constantly in a state of needing to confirm to yourself that you're safe, in a circumstance where that's entirely dependent on outside factors. You have to allow the enemies to get just close enough to where it's about as dangerous as it could possibly be for you before you can even do anything about it, and then you have to suddenly switch to fight mode and act as fast as possible. There's no preemptive planning, no predictable patterns, and no sense of comfort. At least that's how it feels during the first few nights. There's naturally diminishing returns as the more you play, the more you see the same general stuff predictably keeps happening, and you can actually get into a groove. This is not good. The repetitiveness of each night eventually decimates any fear factor. Horror lives or dies on immersion. For you to be immersed in a game or movie requires that you, on some level, forget or ignore that it's a game or movie. This is another big reason why it's beneficial for an atmospheric game to not have too many mechanics or be too difficult. Whereas most games literally force you to understand the system underlying the game, in horror, it's best for the player to remain in the dark about how exactly the game works, since the more they understand, the more they see it as a system of mechanics, and the less they're scared by it. As soon as you understand the system behind the game, You stop seeing it as a scary, haunted pizzeria and start seeing it for the fraud that it is. I think this is why even those who admit to finding the game scary initially typically say it stops being scary somewhere in the middle. I think this is one of the main things the game sorely needed, for things to be shaken up somehow, mechanically or otherwise, somewhere in the latter half. Something to catch the player off guard and to bring back the tension. As it is, this horror game is only scary at most half the time. Not optimal. It is a shame, though, that as the game gets harder, it requires you to think less. And like I said, generally you want to be careful with making your horror game too difficult, since the more you die, the more annoying it gets, and the less scared you are. But if none of the horror works on you, and you're understandably not partial to the gameplay, then there's not much here for you. I'm a total freak who actually likes the gameplay though. I masochistically enjoy the challenge, but I understand if I'm in the minority there. You hear that? I'm a minority. The animatronics themselves just barely reach into uncanniness, but only under certain lighting and within the context of the mechanics and story. They need to find the right spots, somewhere between cute enough to be believable as children's mascots, but creepy enough to be unsettling in the right circumstances. I think the models are well designed as believable mascots and are used well enough under the right lighting to make them creepy, and they're easily some of the most effective in the series. You can really see this in certain renders. Them on stage, Bonnie's silhouette at the end of the hall. I really like the ones with Chica, where she just has her jaw hanging open and her eyes are all droopy. The very odd and awkward posing of the animatronics in ways that are just weird and unnatural, and the tinge of moldy grossness to the textures is exactly the kind of stuff that needs to be done to utilize these things' creep potential, and it's done just barely enough here. They managed to make the most out of the models, and there's a level of subtlety not seen in any of the other games. Though, looking at these guys out of context, it's kind of funny that they're supposed to be coming from a horror game. Oh god, a teddy bear. By the way, who else thought Chica was green when they first saw this thumbnail? Hold up though. What about those pesky, controversial J words? You know what I'm talking about. The jump scare question. There's so many of them. It's the only reason the game got popular. FNAF invented jump scares. Why else would it be so popular? People like saying edgy shit like this. While that's a solid theory, I don't think it holds up under scrutiny. If you can believe it, FNAF wasn't actually the first game to use jump scares, even prominently. Nor was it the first game Markiplier played which cheaply abused leap startles. Nor was it even the first video he used a clickbaity hyperbolic title on. But not all of those games got a movie adaptation. So my claim is that there was probably more to this game's popularity than just those few easy to pick on things. Everyone always says jump scares bad, but nobody asks how is jump scares bad. I mean, some do. And as is mandatory, I have my own stupid, unsolicited opinions on the subject. Now, many do know that spring surprises can be used in tolerable and effective ways. With enough class and dignity, they can be a welcome seasoning to an already scary experience, and can be used as a satisfying payoff and relief to built-up tension. Their poor reputation is mostly thanks to being so easily and commonly abused by uncreative dumb bad-bads who don't know how to actually instill fear in the player, so they instead instill an involuntary instinctual reaction in hopes of tricking people into thinking it's scary. But this only becomes annoying if relied upon, as it often is, and it's almost always completely unnecessary. But FNAFs are a bit more nuanced, since they function as death animations, which means they're essentially a punishment for losing the game. But also, I mean, how else would you represent death in this game that wouldn't end up being inherently jump scary? There needs to be some visual indicator of losing the game. It'd be awkward if the game immediately hard cut to the "you died" screen, with no way of comprehending what even just happened. Even if the animation was less obnoxious, and there wasn't a loud sound accompanying it, it'd still be startling by nature of being a new visual suddenly appearing. So at that point, why not just go all out and make something bombastic? That said, the actual animations are, to put it professionally, silly. They're mostly kinda like tolerable, but especially Freddy's. It's a cartoon teddy bear shaking around and bobbing its head in your face. So if these things have to exist, which I'd argue they do. I'd like them better if they were at least actually scary looking rather than goofy. Point is, I think the significance of jump scares in the game itself, as well as their effect on its popularity, is way overstated by people who want an easy reason to explain why they didn't like the game, or just don't actually know anything about it outside of YouTube thumbnails. I see no reason not to accept the better faith interpretation that the mechanics and environment are the primary source of these reactions. The better criticism is that it's not that scary for many people, and it stops being scary at all halfway through.
I cannot even say I'm remotely scared by anything that happens in this game now.
But back on the topic of the game's design, there's no design. Scott doesn't do that. He's explicitly stated he doesn't do design documents, and just speedruns through development due to ADD. These are generally pretty bad practices. I have to hand it to him that his games are pretty functional and bug-free despite that. That's something AAA devs can't even do. But for real, if you're making a game and you're a part of the 99.9999999% of people, you should really have a decently specific outline of what you want before production. You should also give the project the time it needs to make sure it's as good as it can be. If not, you're seriously risking it being a broken mess that wasn't worth the time. With as simple as the game is, and as much experience as Scott had at that point, FNAF 1 avoids being completely broken, but the higher difficulties reveal the game's bullshit, especially the so-called 420 mode, where the animatronics get super high, bro, in difficulty. This shit is among the most infamous aspects of the game, for good reason. It's bullshit. Generally, maximum difficulty can make the pros and cons of a game's mechanics more obvious, as you're forced to familiarize yourself with the rules in a much more intimate way than usual, and there's much less opportunity for luck. As such, 420 mode reveals a few major flaws in FNAF 1's design. First, and most disappointing to me, that you don't actually have to keep track of the animatronics on the cameras. In fact, you can't. You have to watch no more than one of the cameras, no more than milliseconds at a time. There's no actual mechanical encouragement to, do the main thing you'd think you'd need to in a game based on security cameras. Look at them. If you're gonna make a game about security cameras, I feel like you should utilize their potential more than just making one of them relevant. I don't know, something more than this. I mean, look at this. I get the bullshit is the appeal of this mode, but I'm sure that appeal would still exist if it was more skill-based. These problems aren't as prevalent in earlier nights, but they're still there and are still problems. I think the simplicity of FNAF's gameplay is acceptable, especially for a horror game, but it needed more thought put into how each mechanic affects the other, and what kind of experience that facilitates. It can be a fun, but definitely janky challenge, with some seriously annoying RNG. But nobody cares about that. The last things people like about this horror game is the horror nor the game. It's the child death, a very popular subject it would appear. It's the 8 hours worth of disconnected schizophrenic nonsense loosely approximating a story. But most of that didn't exist yet. These were simpler times, and this really blew people's minds. Sometimes, if you're lucky as well as observant, you may see some things change within the pre-rendered PNGs. Fucking incredible. Scott added a few new image files in his game, probably as an extra fun little thing near the end of development, set them to appear randomly, and the world was never the same again. Now at this point, I throw up in my mouth whenever I hear the word lore, and it comes from my PTSD from years of being a FNAF fan. It's crazy how a few tiny Easter eggs can give people cocaine levels of serotonin, but I do like the first game's approach to story. Since you're looking at camera footage most of the time, if you're a power-wasting idiot, and flipping between them constantly, if you don't know you don't need to, or are just bored, it's really cool to have certain details in those images slightly change in ways that are either creepy and or hint at a backstory. And it helps that the story is beautifully simple, just enough to add a layer of creepiness if you're paying attention. If you somehow don't know, on random and rare occasion, this specific corner of the hallway with this rules of safety paper hanging on the wall, don't shit on the floor kids, will be replaced by excerpts of what reads like a newspaper article about several children going missing at what is presumably this building. There are 4 separate versions of this, each with a different part of the story. No matter who you are, I suspect you have a vague idea of what the story is. Kids go missing, lured into a back room by some creepy fucking mascot costume where they were presumably killed. It's implied he then hid the bodies in the least conspicuous place possible where no one would ever find them, stuffed into the animatronics insides. I guess nobody ever opened them up for maintenance. Or I guess if they did, they just didn't care. The spirits of the children then haunt the animatronics, and that's where you get the events of the main game. It's a little odd, but damn is it perfectly enough. It's morbid, it provides added context for the game itself, and is presented in an engaging way, especially in a meta sense. Since these screens are random and rare, that encouraged people online to talk about them, compare them, and speculate on their meaning. Thus began a massive infamous part of this game's life force, the theorizing. Dun dun dun. It became a game in and of itself to figure out what the hell the story was. It wouldn't quite get to that point yet, though. It's cute looking back on these early games and realize how simple and obvious the story was. Most people had it pretty much figured out. Most theories had to do with the 1 or 2 kind of open questions that ultimately didn't really matter much. Most speculation surrounded what would come to be dubbed by the fans, and later be officially christened as Golden Freddy, who is Freddy but yellow, so completely different. Wonder why they didn't call him Piss Freddy, who is shown just laying on the ground very dead looking, appearing in the office then disappearing just as abruptly. This is accompanied by a garbled voice and images of Freddy and Bonnie with hyper-realistic eyes quickly flashing on the screen with the text, "It's me," a phrase appearing all over the game in Easter eggs. And though it appears everywhere in the game, it would go on to be associated with Golden Freddy. Golden Freddy and the phrase "It's me" were 2 of the biggest loose ends from the first game. It can be deduced that Yellow Freddy was one of the 5 kids who went missing by process of elimination. Loose ends like this are only a problem if, as the series continues, the story never answers enough questions to be satisfying, and especially if it only creates more questions and confusion as it develops. The only open question I find truly unsatisfying in the first game is the "It's me" phrase. I kinda think of it as a message from all of the ghosts trying to tell you that they're still there. And if these are the only problems with the story, then we're doing pretty good so far. The phone guy is adorable. He was never given an official name, literally just referred to as the phone guy. An absolute G. Top tier character. A very straightforward device to deliver story and gameplay exposition, though perfectly immersive, presented as an older employee mentoring a trainee on the job. He also represents a distinct comedic edge to this game, an element that would vary wildly in prominence and execution with each installment. He brings levity as well as adding to the tension through casually mentioning concerning and disturbing shit, then refusing to elaborate, or elaborating on completely unhelpful shit. Like how the company specifically briefs employees on the possibility of death during night guard duty.
Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for damage to property or person. Upon discovering that damage or death have occurred, a missing person report will be filed within 90 days or as soon as property and premises have been thoroughly cleaned and bleached and the carpets have been replaced. Blah, blah, blah. Now that might sound bad, I know.
Complete with a beautifully disinterested and monotone delivery. The company that owns this place has always been a weird background character, as it seems they're acutely aware of the hauntings, but actively decide to do nothing about it for no particular reason.
But then there was the bite of 87.
Despite its infamy, the
Bite of 87.
was never actually elaborated on in the entire series. The popular idea is that the protag from FNAF 2 got bit by one of those animatronics, probably Mangle. Not super interesting, and not something shown or said in the game itself. And that's fine by me. I think I actually prefer the Bite of 87 as something that's just mentioned in the first game, and you're left to wonder what the fuck a Bite of 87 means. I think that's pretty funny and great, actually. The first game had the right amount of story and loose threads. It wasn't even all that necessary to elaborate on it, and I just like the story of the first game. It's generally a good horror story, though not without some legit questions. Like, why would you come back after the first night in this fucking job? But for as much as I've been defending it, and as much as I'm a closeted fan of this game, I absolutely do not think it deserved the obnoxious avalanche of worshippers it garnered. I think the game is fine for what it is, as a small indie game. It does some creative and even unique things, but compared to the genre as a whole, it's mostly tolerable. It has only some standout characteristics that caught people's attention. It didn't quite deserve the sheer amount and degree of praise that would be thrown onto it, and I think that's why there was a wave of backlash after its peak started ending. By no means am I trying to hand wave off criticism by saying the backlash was motivated by the game's popularity, but it'd be stupid to believe that the overpopularity wasn't a significant or even primary factor for the intensity of the backlash. If you were an unassuming horror fan, hearing oceans of people hyping this thing up, telling you that this game is the scariest game of all time, the newest big thing that you just have to play immediately, then sink $5 into it and you're just met with this?
What? That's it? That's it? It's a jump scare? It's a little bunny rabbit jump scare? Really? Really? Alright. I mean, oh god, it's so terrifying.
Because of course it's not the scariest game of all time. It's not even one of the scariest games of all time. It doesn't hold a candle to the most well-crafted and creative horror experiences in games. There are many that are leagues above what this game was doing in terms of craft. Teams of people spent years carefully building an experience that was carefully designed to best invoke the most fear possible out of the most amount of people possible. FNAF was made by one dude within a few months, specifically designed to be short and quick out of desperation to add another source of income to help support his family. This doesn't make it bad, obviously, but it's gotta know its place. It's a point-and-click game with a pre-rendered teddy bear PNG saying boo in your face. It's kinda cute, though it's the kind of cute that's also kinda stupid, but that's also kinda why it's cute. So, I don't know. The way I look at it, this game is made up of a bunch of neat little touches. The base concepts of horror with animatronics and security cameras is neat, and the simplistic execution of it and the janky design is excusable as far as it doesn't hinder the average player's experience. But if you're gonna make a sequel, you gotta expand on the base concepts and explore ways to elaborate on them as well as bring in new concepts. Luckily, FNAF 2 didn't do that. Instead, the creative decision was made to do the same thing again, but faster and more intense. Say what you will about these games and or me, but it honestly impresses me how quickly he made these things, even with how simple they are. You could argue they might have been too frequent, and annoyingly so for many, and consequently probably rushed, and you might be right. But the production quality of these games could have, and logically probably should have been far worse for how fast these things were pumped out. I can't see it as anything other than impressive that Five Nights 2 is as well put together as it is, considering it was entirely made within just 2 fucking months. Kind of arguably, just as significant as the games themselves was the climate surrounding the lead up to their release. In particular, I'm coyly referencing the legendary teasers on Scott Cawthon's website. One of the most prime you had to be there moments. These were some of the most fun parts of being a FNAF kid. Something I still have a lot of nostalgia for, as you can tell. That's the psychological impact this shit's had on me. I mean damage. I mean inspiration. I mean damage. Scott's website, creatively named scottgames.com, would become infamous as the hub for new information on upcoming releases. He removed everything else that was once on there to host teasers for FNAF 2. Most of them were standard promotional material, stuff for fans to chew on. But on one fateful day, he decided to post this, a nearly fully black image with just a camera button sprite. Unless you took it into an image editing software and increased the brightness enough to accentuate the slight differences in color and make the rest of the colors visible to the naked eye. This shit would become a consistent part of his MO. This one revealed the puppet character, or as it was called back then, and I think is actually a better sounding name, the marionette. And of course, this element of the fans having to act in order to get information absolutely printed engagement. Now, FNAF 1's gameplay gets overly hard and the design isn't well suited for such an increase in speed. But that game's borderline broken non-design has got nothing on FNAF 2's tomfoolery. FNAF 2's gameplay is a troll. You can survive predictably enough throughout the main campaign, but this game's 420, 1020, oh god, they have a stoner day in October now, really reveals more numerous egregious problems with the base mechanics, and come up a lot more frequently throughout the entire run. Because of how many fuckers there are now, 11 total, and because there wasn't enough thought put into the dynamics between the mechanics, it's way too easy for multiple characters to overlap and attack you all at once, to the point it's literally impossible to recover. This was the reason for at least half of my failed 1020 attempts, specifically Toy Bonnie. Fuck this cunt. Sometimes it's just not possible to wind the music box enough so that it'll last long enough while you're forced to wait things out with the mask on for however long they randomly decide. And if you try to make up for it next time by winding it longer, you will be met with Foxy being an unforgiving cock. And you will inevitably run into this bullshit often. Sure, these problems are most prominent in 1020 mode, a bonus level most players aren't going to experience, but that night runs on the same code, for lack of a better term, that the rest of them do. And so it highlights issues in the design of the game in general, being that there is no design. Or more accurately, there's not much planning involved in the design enough to account for these unfair circumstances. I imagine he might not have seen these as any real problem anyway, seeing it as just a part of the challenge, but it's just unfair. And because of the difficulty, the game basically forces the player to become intensely focused on the mechanics and to try to figure out the system. I believe the intention was to throw the player into as much of a confused panic as possible, until they inevitably figure it out around the halfway point and it becomes repetitive again, and scariness is replaced with frustration. Though this game does use different setups of enemies for the first few nights, unlike the first, so that's kind of like changing things up and keeping the player on edge for the first 2 nights. I think as a general rule, if you want to make a game scary, you should try to avoid making it super difficult. For a player to beat a difficult game, they have to become super familiar and intimate with the mechanics. They're essentially peeking behind the curtain and see the enemies less as monsters and more as the video game obstacles they are. It's less immersive and less scary the more you see it as a game. A horror creator has to mask the mechanics as much as possible to maintain the illusion of these situations being scary as long as possible. I don't want to definitively say you can't make a difficult and scary game, but there's a tug of war you'll have to play between difficulty and immersion, as they naturally don't want to play nice with each other. The bunker is the closest I've seen to a difficult game also being super scary, but the mechanics are immersively well dressed up as things you would believably do in the situation if it were real, and it's designed in such a way that dying is nearly always your own damn fault. But even then, it still loses scariness after a while, especially the more you die. I think my biggest gripe with the gameplay is how it doesn't really expand on the base premise of the first game. It extends it, in a way. A sequel provides, among other things, an opportunity to improve what came before, but FNAF 2 is basically more of the same. It didn't solve any of the problems of the first game, nor was it adding any new dimensions to it, nor was it really trying to, and I think that's a shame. I don't think this game has as effective of a spooky atmosphere as the first. Not ideal considering the first barely even worked on me. The office itself is brightly lit, and the building in general has a clean industrial look. It's not impossible to make bright and clean locations creepy, but harder. And the flashlight thing in the cameras, where there's a spotlight shining directly out from the direction of the camera, creates a flat, overly revealing light scenario that doesn't do the already non-scary models any favors. Even with the wizards, which excrete some inherent creepiness, the missed opportunity to creepify them further with creative lighting holds them back. Seriously, it's amazing what creative lighting can do, especially for an unsettling atmosphere. I understand it might have seemed like an interesting mechanic in theory, but this flashlight thing is really shooting the game in the foot. As such, the renders in this game are not nearly as good as the first, but there's also not as rich of a soundscape. There's no random schizo noises anymore. Aww. Everything you hear has some gameplay significance, down to even the ambient track, changing based on what's happening. The place doesn't feel as haunted as a result.
It loses a bit of depth, and it honestly doesn't feel as real, if that makes sense. Yes, FNAF is real. These new animatronics are even less scary than their elders, and not even creepy lighting would probably be able to save them. The creepiest they get is with Toy Chica sans beak, but the other two aren't at all. I like the puppet's design, I like the variety it brings, and it comes closer than the toys to actually being unsettling. The wizards are the closest thing to creepy. Bonnie's unfastening looks pretty cool, so no head. And Chica's perpetual T-posing is one of the few times I think Scott consciously attempted to use the fact that these are janky robots for uncanniness. The creepiest FNAF 2 ever gets is with these little cutscenes of FNAF 1 before each night, and with the pseudo minigame slash pseudo cutscenes which sometime appear after death. The vibe of these is well done. They're presented as janky old arcade games, representing disturbing events in a low-res style, which I think is actually more effective than seeing these in a realistic style would be, because of the dissonance of it being an almost cartoony style, and the lack of detail allows your brain to do the work imagining it for you, which will always feel creepier than just seeing it. These rare screens are also creepy, but they're too rare to really count. Also too rare to really mean anything are the Easter eggs in general this time around. There are no directly story-related ones, not counting the minigames, which are technically random, but I wouldn't count those as Easter eggs. Golden Freddy is now a regular part of the gameplay. This time we got a bunch of random nonsense characters, like an alternatively colored balloon boy that appears under the desk. An endoskeleton shows up in the music box room and then does nothing. This adorable paper plate guy that can appear in your office. What the fuck is this? These guys are annoying to me since they're literally unexplainable based on this game alone. I have no idea what the fuck they're supposed to mean, man. And they come back in FNAF 3 in an inexplicably prominent role, no less. Like, what the fuck are they? You can't just do that and refuse to elaborate. Why he Orpal? Most of the Easter eggs in FNAF 2 come off as an afterthought, which is weird since Easter eggs were such a big part of what made FNAF 1 interesting to people. All of these add nothing to the story, nor contribute anything to the atmosphere or general player experience other than, oh, how about that? That's weird. Anyway, before this one, any story that FNAF had was relegated to rare Easter eggs and passing mentions by an unreliable side character. In FNAF 2, parts of the story are presented in a more direct way. Sometimes after dying, which is a lot so you'll definitely see these, you'll be forced to play a little Atari-style minigame cutscene thing that presumably represents something in the backstory. Mostly reiterating stuff we already know, except for this one, which seemed to be an origin for the marionette, as a separate sixth victim of the
Purple guy!
Also, these introduced a beloved staple character of the franchise,
Purple guy!
an apparent visual representation of the killer, and the most detail we'd get about him for a while. Not a lot of detail. Back in the good old days when we just knew him as
Purple guy!
By the way, remember Vincent? Remember when FNAF fans turned a serial child murderer into a Jeff the Killer-esque anime boy? Good times. Despite this being a big change in presentation, there's actually not a whole lot of new story here. It's mostly more child murder. Hell yeah! And some confusing lore details, just to be an asshole. FNAF 2 is a prequel. Spoilers. So the withered animatronics are broken down versions of the old ones, but in the past, then later remade for FNAF 1. And these new ones were decommissioned. And the marionette guy just didn't show up in FNAF 1, I guess. But this is clearly a different building. And there's a bunch of promos everywhere saying this is a reopening, because this is actually a reopening of the previous, even older version of Freddy's. So now we have 3 different eras of the story being established, between at least 2 different locations. But that wasn't enough, so we actually get another, even older version of Freddy's introduced, with a confusingly different name no less.
Red Bear's Family Diner or something like that.
So this story's getting real simple and straightforward now. I really don't like the popular idea at the time that there were 2 missing children incidences. That there were 2 sets of 5 kids killed to account for both sets of animatronics, and to explain these bodies in this minigame. It makes it feel less dramatic, like these lives lost are just becoming numbers. It's interesting that despite this being a popular fan theory for a while, there aren't any explicit references to a second set of 5 dead kids in the games. The few times we directly see the ghosts, it's always just 5, or at most 6, to include the puppet spirit. Hell, even FNAF 6 only ever references the original 5 or 6 kids, despite them already getting their conclusion in 3. There's nothing about this supposed second set of 5 anywhere. Since we never see these two proposed sets of killed kids in the same room at the same time, I think the implication is more likely supposed to be that the original 5 kids possessed the Wizards, as those were the original animatronics, and the toy animatronics, being built with parts from the Wizards, received some sort of residual possession, and the FNAF 1 ones were also made from the Wizards. It's weird and is never explained further, maybe that's a good time, but that's the cleanest interpretation I can muster for why there's 11 seemingly possessed robots in this game. Either that or they're just after you because of their access to a criminal database makes their way too advanced for the time AI think you're a pedo.
They're all tied into some kind of criminal database so they can detect a predator a mile away.
So they crawl in the vents and kill you and shit or something, but I think that actually makes less sense, so I don't cherry pick that into my headcanon. That's enough bullshit theorizing. I'm not MatPat, RIP. I'm not here to write Scott's story for him. Basically, I think this is one instance where, even in the early games, there's needless convolution to the story. At least you can still get a general gist with relative ease, but damn. A funny little flaw in the story is in the exact date this game is supposedly set in. It's obviously 1987, but the check also says it's November. Meanwhile, the phone guy welcomes you to your new summer job.
Hello and welcome to your new summer job.
MatPat tried to make sense of this by saying the messages were pre-recorded months ago, but that would mean you'd be there after the place apparently closes down like the phone guy says, and why would the phone guy rhetorically asking,
What on earth are you doing there? Didn't you get the memo?
make any sense as a pre-recorded message? And since it seemingly wouldn't make a difference either way, it makes much more sense to say this is a mistake. Not a huge deal. Just kind of funny in a series where people kind of have to dig super deep into details like this to make sense of it. And so Scott ends up accidentally completely misleading people into crazy tangents like this. Obviously, that's a persistent problem in the series. While I'm on the topic of the phone calls, there's a really weird aspect of the story with how I've been portraying it so far. If the animatronics are possessed by ghosts who were killed before the events of this game, which they'd have to be possessed the whole game, and they have to be possessed or else that'd mean there's no functional difference between being possessed or not, and if the phone calls were not recorded a while ago, then what did someone use the yellow suit for, according to the Night 6 phone call?
Someone used one of the suits. We had a spare in the back, a yellow one. Someone used it.
The only thing you can connect using a yellow suit with, from what we know already, is the killer using a mascot costume to lure kids. But this can't be the missing children's incidents if the robots are already haunted since night 1, and if there was only ever one set of 5 missing kids. But both of those are most likely the case for the aforementioned reasons, leaving this yellow suit incident kind of a mystery as to what exactly it's supposed to be referencing, assuming you agree with my other interpretations. You can always build your own FNAF lore with whichever of these ingredients you like, if you don't share my tastes. Other than those details and fan theories, I have less to say about the story in this one, considering it really is mostly reiterating stuff from the first game, and making it more confusing. So I guess that's what I have to say about it. I can't believe I'm saying this, but FNAF 2 is no longer my favorite like it was in my teens. Aww. If I were to attempt to decipher my 14-year-old brain, I think I liked it mostly for the challenge of the gameplay. It's the one I played the most over the years, and as such, it will always be the most nostalgic for me. But after maturing, and looking at it as a creative project, and after accidentally beating 1020 recently, I hardly want to look at this thing ever again. It still counts as fine, I think, but derivative, and doesn't have much value by itself as the first game does. It's hardly scary enough to be a worthwhile horror experience, and as a challenging video game, it's too RNG based to be much fun. Overall, a step down from the first Five Nights at Freddy's. But that didn't stop the exponentially exploding number of addicts from feeling just as much, if not more, of a high from this one. And where there's demand, there must be supply, and the dealer had no qualms with providing even more. It's easy easy to forget, but when Markiplier said
This might be the most hyped game in the history of gaming,
he was only kind of exaggerating. Despite FNAF 2's flaws, it was satisfying enough for the mass of ADHD children to be ecstatic at the prospect of yet another one. And at this point, the fan base was cementing. The virus was spreading, and it was embedding itself into the intestines of the internet. But the rapid spread of any virus, in turn, provokes an immune response. And even though there was probably very little FNAF 3 could do that wouldn't satisfy the most hardcore users, the overall weak nature of this latest mutation would leave it vulnerable to attacks by the immune system of the internet. If you can't follow my epic mixed metaphors, not everyone liked this one, even more so now. And I think that's what left room for the detractors of the series in general to really start voicing their annoyance. And not for nothing. Though there's still stuff I'm gonna compliment in the coming paragraphs, this game definitely left a lot to be desired in a lot of ways. The promotion for this game was pretty legendary though. The trailer is one of the better ones. I like the part with Springtrap tweaking. You immediately get the feeling something's off when you realize you have to click on the buttons rather than just hover over them. I can't imagine a good reason for this, other than just making things different for the sake of it, but it's just worse. It feels so much better and is so much faster, which is very important in the series, to be able to just flick your cursor to activate the cameras. Off to a bizarre start. The vomit green also rubs many the wrong way. I can understand why people don't like it, but I can hardly agree it's a bad thing by itself. What I want to highlight is a missed opportunity to fully utilize the unique setting of this game. It's a horror attraction, specifically designed in-universe to be scary. With a setting like this, you have a built-in excuse to splurge your creative juices all over, make it cartoonishly freakish looking. I like the color green, don't get me wrong, but you could have had many different colors and interesting visuals. The spookiest things in this place are the animatronic heads with lights in them. This would make for a very lame horror attraction. When the map was first revealed before the game's release, many assumed these alternate paths on the outside would be essentially backrooms for the presumed actors could move between places beyond the sight of the guests, like how a real haunted house might function. That would make a lot more sense than a whole labyrinth of big-ass vents with cameras and doors inside them for some reason. Pristine crawlable vents are a ridiculous trope in a lot of media, but it's still silly, and definitely makes no sense they would have cameras and doors in them. Springtrap is a cool concept for a horror villain. I agree with the Spurgs who constantly repeat this. The idea of a serial killer smushed inside of an old, derelict, creepy children's mascot is fucking rad. That's why he's called Springtrap, by the way. Spring, because of the vaguely described spring-based mechanisms the suit supposedly built with that somehow allows people to climb inside. And trap, as in he looks different on the outside than he is on the inside. Though he needs to hit the gym. His model seems a bit chubby, and the way that deterioration is done on these models looks like such an eyesore once you notice it. He seems to just delete polygons and then apply a slight smoothing modifier of some kind. I don't know, I don't use 3ds Max. And then calls it a day, which really isn't convincing. The tears in these models look really pixelated, and this is a habit he refuses to kick. I find it hard to imagine he couldn't have just straightened the edges more, delete or merge some edges or vertices until the tears look sharper and not made of squares. Also, the material of his exterior could be more rich, have more variation in the color, more filth on it, I don't know. And that's all without even mentioning the nonsensical meat spaghetti inside the suit. Still, the overall concept is metal, and this comes decently close to executing it perfectly. And of course, those iconic rare Easter egg renders of him, those are great. Despite the general lameness of the aesthetics, it does sometimes go hard. Though Springtrap's kind of an idiot. Really, bro? You can't tell I'm fucking with you with this pre-recorded child's voice? I think the detail dropped by the phone guy that the animatronics are programmed to follow sounds is meant to be an explanation for this, but I find it funny to imagine that William Afton is perpetually fooled by this cheesy-ass gag. Not only is the color palette comparable to Vomit, but the gameplay is too. You can cheese Springtrap for most of the game until Night 5 where there's a steep difficulty cliff. At least that's what I experienced. I sped ran through the first 4 nights in one sitting, and then it took me 3 separate days to beat night 5. Also, can I not get him to fuck off when he's at my window? I'd think I would be able to, but can't seem to ever make it happen. The errors are not fun to deal with. It's not fun to have to put the camera down, slowly pan over to the opposite end of the screen, click one of the buttons on the ugly terminal thing, and have to sit and wait there until the game shuts the fuck up and you're allowed to move your head again. I understand them as an element of chaos, but the way you have to deal with them is just tedious, and sometimes has the good old FNAF tradition of randomly deciding to make it impossible for you to win. Whereas the second game was fundamentally more of the same, and thus inherited problems from the first, 3 seems to try to rectify one of the main issues I whined about the first game. It seems to try to make watching the cams more of a necessity, but it doesn't work at all. No, I'm just kidding, it actually does. The way to defend yourself is through buttons on the camera panel, and you have to pay attention to where Sping Tap is to lure him away from you. And I like how he can be seen in different positions in each camera, which is a level of complexity not seen in the other ones. And it forces you to really look for him, because he can be hidden sometimes. But this system obviously doesn't lend itself well to a very fast pace, which is why Night 5 was so annoying to me. Once random distraction events are introduced, if you're supposed to pay more attention to the cameras, it kinda defeats the purpose when you have no time to frickin' do that. But since the entire game is oriented around this mechanic where you can lure him around the map, it means that that has to be effective enough to not be unfair, which means you can all too easily force him into a far corner of the map and then just block the vent whenever he goes in. This is kind of the problem with having only one enemy. The mechanics aren't designed well or robust enough to make it not easy while also not being bullshit and not boring. The errors are meant to be the counter to this, but those are just annoying as they interrupt the core loop, then force you to just sit and wait. And there's really no way to deal with him if even just one of the errors is active. It'd be cool if, when the video goes out, you could still listen to tell where he might be, but there's no audio cues hinting where he might be. Something like that would have made it less annoying. And maybe the map should have been more circular and not have really any dead ends in which you can trap him, or just not have a door in the vent right next to this corner, making it impossible for him to escape your wrath. And maybe, instead of the current error system, you are meant to pay attention to some glorified minigame throughout the night, dressed up as some security guard task that takes your attention away from Springtrap while also being engaging in and of itself. And I also don't think the atmosphere is good enough to effectively fill the dead air when the pace is slower. And there's still no random spooky ghost sounds anymore either. Man. Also, the game lies to you. Straight up, it contains disinformation. Real shit, there are fake spring traps. It's not a glitch, it swears. I guess it's supposed to be a hallucination. Sometimes you'll see the guy where he isn't, and there's no indication other than deducing if it makes sense for him to be there. Problem is, you don't have the luxury of going through the deduction process when you have no more than seconds between finding him, activating the lures, and dealing with the errors. It's just unfair. For all my Saul Goodman-ass desperate defending of the jump scares in the first game, FNAF 3 makes a liar out of me. The jump scares in this one are the first indefensible ones in the series. Random, they completely deflate the rising tension, you get way too used to them, way faster, and they're far from necessary. They're just random events that cause the errors to activate if you don't react fast enough within 0.2 milliseconds of seeing the phantoms. They're meant to add yet another element of chaos in a desperate attempt to stop you from cheesing the game or feeling bored. But it just feels like the game is cheesing me. And for all of that, I get a bad ending. Fuck you, man. The thing that carries the game, and saves it from being the worst to only the second worst, is the story elements it adds to the series. The killer gets his dramatically ironic comeuppance at the invisible hands of the ghost kids themselves. They stuff him into a suit. It's not an amazing story, and there are some holes in it, but it's a neat little horror story idea and gives a satisfying conclusion to the small amount of story that was in the previous games, for the freaks who cared about that. I'm freaks. And as with the previous games, I like the simplicity of it. That's something I'll emphasize as much as possible while I still can, before the lore loses its fucking mind. You can even figuratively, through some abstract weirdness, help the spirits rest, which is a concept I love. Things like the so-called happiest day playable cutscene makes me think Scott had some idea of what he was doing with the story. The concept and presentation of this is appropriately melancholic, and the implication of the spirits finally moving on is very narratively satisfying. Though the way to get that ending, without the aid of YouTubers, is fucking schizophrenic. The reason for that is very obviously a desperate attempt to keep the crazed Redditors from finding everything within hours of the game's release, only for them to find everything within hours of the game's release. There wasn't enough consideration for how this would play on its own. It's ridiculous to get this ending. Not enough comprehensible clues are given that would lead anyone to naturally figure out this process themselves, which I think is inherently a detriment. MatPat's insistence on the purple guy being the phone guy during this time is hilarious. Not just because it's obviously wrong, especially at this point, but because it really didn't matter who the killer was, other than just being the killer. Like, did it need to be some other character we already knew about? The fact that those kinds of questions were the ones still lingering as loose ends after the first 3 games goes to show how much we actually knew, and how little else actually needed explaining. I would say that the only thing that legitimately required clarification was probably the meaning behind the shadow animatronics, because without FNAF 4, there's no way to even guess what they could be, and even with FNAF 4, it's still all wishy-washy. But in FNAF 2, they appear out of nowhere and don't make any sense, only for them to be featured very prominently in 3, still without any intelligible clues as to why. It's the most frustrating thing about FNAF 3's story. Otherwise, the story is by far the best part of the game. It ain't spotless, you could pick it apart quite a bit, but it's pretty good as far as the FNAF story goes. Five Nights 3 deserves its reputation, especially after replaying it. Not necessarily as the worst one, I'll get into the actual worst one later, but as a disappointment, especially for its hype. I was satisfied enough at the time, but only because of the story. Even back then, this was the first one I didn't even really bother to play. So, you know, take that for what you will. Speaking of Markiplier, several minutes ago, he also said this about the game.
I don't even think that I want there to be any more Five Nights at Freddy's after this.
I vaguely shared this sentiment, so imagine the feeling when I saw this fucking shit. After the final game in the series, Scott made the second final game in the series, out of about 3 or 4 final games. 3 was undoubtedly meant to be the end of the series, obvious already based on how it had a climax in it, and what are basically the main characters are now dead. But it was explicitly admitted by the man himself.
The story was going to be 3 games.
But then he just couldn't fucking help it. See, like I already said, it was a disappointment for many people. It was boring, it was confusing, and most importantly, it wasn't scary, even to FNAF fans. That being said, I get making a 4th one. I honestly might have done the same, or at least seriously considered it. The story had concluded, but people were unsatisfied with the game itself, and there were still plenty of downright unexplainable random Easter eggs that made next to no sense that you could probably expand on. It makes sense to want to end on a higher note, but obviously tricky to make the story work as essentially a second ending. This game is different because it has animations. Ooh, ah. I remember this house being better looking. I remember being impressed by these environments and animations as a kid. Now I just kinda see all the flaws. I find it charming though. The atmosphere is still constructed very well. This is a neat attempt to shake up the formula. Not being in an office, not having a camera system, and having to rely on sound to tell what's going on. This game gets the second closest to actually being scary. Sound is already a disproportionately significant part of what makes an atmosphere immersive, let alone having gameplay mechanics that force you to place mental emphasis on them. And the atmosphere itself is already cool, being mostly made up of normal, natural sounds that you would expect to hear in this environment. On top of an ambient loop that itself has this calming wind chime type sound. It's a very comfortable, nostalgic, and grounded tone, and then the familiar childlike vibe is further subverted once you start seeing and hearing the spooky creatures prowling around the house. I absolutely love the atmosphere of FNAF 4. It's one of my favorites of any horror game. And the flashlight is probably the most tension building mechanic in any of these games.
Having to stare into the black abyss, waiting for some breathing sound to abruptly break the silence, and then having to commit to pressing a button and face the 60-40 chance your ears will be blown the fuck out. Shit's fucked up, man. There's natural anxiety to begin with from not knowing what you're gonna see, and in this game, contrary to the norm, every time you get jump scared, as you anticipate it more, it becomes even more stressful. The jump scares are louder in this one. And that was the entire point of the game's creation, apparently. Markiplier wannabes didn't pog as hard at the sussy furry as they did the quirky teddy bears. So Scott sacrificed the creative integrity of the franchise for the sake of the jump scares. As well he should. These jump scares are the absolute most jump and scare to end all jump scares.
The first night is never usually that bad in any of the games, so I'll play through.
These character designs are so scary that they're ultimately not scary. Seriously, they're trying too hard. The designs are very busy. If this is in the nightmare land of this traumatized kid, then you have a lot more room for creative monster designs than just giving them lots of teeth. Probably the biggest problem, for this game, is the repetitiveness of it. I mean, that's the problem with all these games. But I think you can especially feel it in this one, because there's less to look at, less variation in the visuals, and you mostly end up doing the exact same pattern over and over again, with even less room to fuck around than usual. And unexpected things rarely happen in this one. The patterns feel super strict, and it's only broken up in Night 5, once Fat Piss Bear is activated. I appreciate everything being suddenly all whacked up in Night 5, since the formula has desperately needed that for 3 games now. But in a way, Night 5 feels especially repetitive because of how fast Fredbear's pattern is. There's a lot more repeated loops in his behavior within just one night. The 5th night only has Fredbear, this Eldritch Chungus. I'm sorry. Unlike the others, he doesn't play footsteps when walking down the hall, only sprinting left and right before picking a side, then sneaking toward the door. So you have to just listen to what side he's running to, wait for a sec, and if you don't hear him again, immediately shut the door on that side until you hear more footsteps. Then if he laughs, he's likely either on the bed or in the closet. Problem is, not always. Sometimes he just fucking laughs to be an asshole. He does a little trolling. The best you can do is be mindful of any footsteps after the laugh and wait one more second before checking. But you have very little room to fuck around before finding out. So Fredbear is kinda bullshit. He's actually pretty easy compared to the others, but he straight up lies to you sometimes. And I guess that's where the luck element of this game comes in. You can't spell FNAF without RNG. I'm guessing Nightmare is the same, but I don't know because I'm not playing that shit.
I knew he was black! I knew he was black!
Once you get the hang of the game, it's actually pretty easy. But it also doesn't lend itself well to the super fast difficulty of Nightmare mode. The design is better suited for a slower pace than is typical for late game FNAF, especially since you have to wait for the animations. So I found Nightmare mode just annoying, let alone 420. This game does not need those extra modes. It's kinda miserable to play those nights. Fun with Plushtrap is fucking easy clap though. The self-contained parts of the story, I think, are good. That of a kid having nightmares of the Freddy characters after a traumatic event that left him hospitalized. An awesome detail is the Easter eggs of hospital equipment that could sometimes appear beside the bed. Good shit. I feel like that little snippet, that summary, is just as good as FNAF 1's story, in how it does more with less, and how inherently disturbing and morbid it is. It starts getting confusing when you try to connect it to the rest of the games. Who is this kid? Why are we seeing his story? It'd be kinda weird, as the intended final chapter of the series, as an epilogue after the first climax of the series, to tell the story of some rando who was bullied a lot. And what of the random references to the toy animatronics of FNAF 2?
there's a clear reference to Mangle, and a subtle nod to a beakless toy chica, with what we could naturally presume are figures of the toy animatronics. Most people say this crying child, lovingly nicknamed Crying Child, became the spirit that haunted Golden Freddy. Makes some thematic sense, as he was killed by a yellow bear animatronic, and was close friends with a Fredbear Fumo. Problem is, Golden Freddy's seat is already taken by the fifth missing child referenced in the original articles. And I straight up disagree with the idea that there are two spirits inside Golden Freddy, as there is literally no evidence of that in the games whatsoever. No, not even in those two glowing eyes in the FNAF 3 end screen. Obviously, that wasn't Scott's intention when making this render at the time. He just put a light source inside the model, and that light source naturally filled the inside of the head, reflecting off the other end of the model and shining through both eye sockets. You'll notice Freddy and Bonnie's heads also have some light reflecting through their left eyes, and have the light source in one eye, complete with a halo around it, just like this single light source and halo around Golden Freddy's right eye. There's nothing about this that's peculiar. This is a clear example of people reinterpreting innocuous things from old games and erroneously describing it as a clue for new concepts introduced in the books. Also, where is this supposed other spirit in the Happiest Day cutscene? There's no evidence in the games for Golden Freddy having two spirits inside it, not even in the recent ones. Sorry. If that is the intended story, there needs to be actual evidence for it in the new games. But what if our crying child is Puppet? A popular theory at the time. This one also has symbolic connections, as the kid sports a white and black striped t-shirt and is seen crying all the time, which parallels the puppet's design. This might also be why the puppet is suspiciously absent in the game, whereas literally every other character gets some representation in some form. Only problem is, there's a literal flatline sound effect at the end of the game, practically confirming that the kid dies, making it hard for him to be the same kid outside of Freddy's and in the FNAF 2 minigame, which is largely assumed to be the puppet's backstory since he jump scares you at the end of it. And who the fuck else would this kid be? Without that flatline, I feel like this would actually be definitive, but as it is, who the hell knows? But here's the big one. This is the Bite of 87. Or it is. Or it was supposed to be. Maybe. It's complicated. That's the only possible reason for there being random 8s and 7s hidden all over the HTML code of Scott's website during the lead up to the game. And why all the teasers used phrases like, "Was it me?" and "Was it me?" and "or me." And that's why there's figures of the toy animatronics, as they would have debuted at the time. But then the year 1983 is randomly included in a commercial on this TV as an Easter egg. But even then, that could be conceptualized as an established in 1983 thing. And this was meant to tell when Freddy's began as a property or something. Or it could be a copyright date saying the current year. But if this is supposed to be set in 1983, what in the cosmic shit would be the point of the toy animatronic figures? The toy animatronics wouldn't exist yet, as they were new models designed for their reopening of Freddy's in 1987. And if it was the other way around, if the toy animatronics were based on these toy figures, then what would be the point of that information? Why even bother telling us that? And especially, why would the creator point out the Toy Chica figure as if it's some sort of clue? If this is 1983, then these toy animatronic figures are basically a plot hole. But just when you hoped I was done with the theories, future me came crashing in to add yet another paragraph to this section. As it would happen, because it did, I've recently become Mike-pilled on FNAF 4, whereas I have historically been hesitant to accept that the Foxy Bro was the character you're playing as in the gameplay. It would explain why the whiny bitch boy doesn't fit in the greater narrative, because he doesn't. It's his brother who does. And the point of FNAF 4 is to show the origins of who would potentially be the protagonist of the other 3 games. This interpretation doesn't really have any logical problems other than a huge glaring problem that is the different names on the paychecks. Fuck. Obviously he could be changing his name, but do I really just have to assume that? I would prefer there to be some hint of an explanation for why this is one guy changing his name, rather than having to just assume he has to in order to fit this interpretation. Even though this makes the most sense, I think I like the Golden Freddy idea more. I really like the idea that the FNAF 4 party is a parallel to the Happiest Day, and the Happiest Day is all about giving the crying child the happy birthday he never had. So I'm stuck at an impasse between the more narratively satisfying Golden Freddy theory and the relatively more logically sound Foxy Bro idea. The point of all that is, oh yeah, no, I always felt like the bite of 83 is silly. It's just awkward to have 2 significant bites in the story, and it's another reason why I think this game was originally going to be about the bite of 87, because when making a story, why would you make the bite of 83 when you already have the bite of 87? The dramatic climax of this game could have been anything, but it was specifically a bite. Like, it's just weird to me that that would be a part of the core idea from the very beginning. I think any interpretation of FNAF 4's story has some sort of problem. The FNAF lore was always ridiculous and vague, but some things were obvious, and you could use those pieces to draw a general picture of the story. FNAF 1's lore was quite literally laid out on paper, and in FNAF 2 you straight up see a guy killing a bunch of people, and you see those victims being placed inside the animatronics. FNAF 3 is similar. You see that same killer meeting his demise. The good ending is super obscure, but once you see it, the meaning is pretty obvious. FNAF 4, at best, straight up lacks necessary information, and at worst, it contradicts the first 3 games. I have a FNAF theory of my own. Get a load of this. I kinda like to think that the subtitle, The Final Chapter, is a reference to Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, which was the 4th entry in the series, and was of course not the final chapter, just like this game is famous for, which also has a decidedly old school horror theme going on. I honestly wonder if Scott was acutely aware that this might not actually be the final game, and titled it this way as a subtle nod to that fact. I don't know. I like FNAF 4, more than some in the series anyway. I don't think it's when FNAF jumped the shark, that honor goes to another, but it was when the general timeline started getting near impossible to understand. A lot of people have said that FNAF should have ended at the 3rd or 4th game. And yeah, the story would have been in a better place than it is now, but I think the reality is that Sister Location Onward, and especially Security Breach, should have just been better than they were. There's nothing inherently wrong with making more games, as much as it might be annoying for many people, as long as there's some value in it, and the pros manage to outweigh the cons. Unfortunately, we don't live in that timeline. And not only is everything after 4 excessive, but also has only made things confusing and frustrating for many people. And I would have preferred FNAF to end already so I could more easily look back on it with some fondness, and maybe not feel as cringe for having rose-tinted glasses for it. And I could make some pretentious video essay titled, FNAF was better than you remember, or some shit. But alas, this shit's never ending. For some reason, this has to be one of those franchises on infinite life support. Such is life in modernity. I remember not even wanting Scott to do another one. Even back when I was a kid in love with these games, I was already feeling the honeymoon phase wearing off. I was kinda hoping he would move on to a new concept entirely. Maybe that Desolate Hope sequel he mentioned once, or even a totally new horror idea. I was holding out hope that's what this abstract shit was, but then it wasn't. Finally, we get to the peak of the series, FNAF World. I'm not joking. Honestly, I don't think I have any energy to talk about this one. Does that make me lazy? Yeah. Basically, it's pretty stupid, obviously rushed. It could have been fun if it had more effort put in at first, and a tone more like Update 2, which I think was honestly great. Like if it was just a shitposty, just for fun kind of deal for fans. Other than that, the only thing I'd care to comment on is the lore. Yes, there's lore in this game.
I mean, of course. Does this game look like it's not hiding something? The lore in FNAF World seems like it's trying to be a lot more obvious, but still doesn't make any sense. It reiterates symbolisms from the past games, specifically 3 and 4. There is repeated language of putting pieces together and we are still your friends from FNAF 4, and then references to the FNAF 3 puzzles that unlocked the good ending. It feels like it's trying to beat us over the head with something, but it's still not obvious exactly what. Why repeat these themes? Especially in a game where it looks completely out of place. If you want this game to mean anything, you have to get pretty creative. In a time when the lore really needed clearing up, this did the opposite. Update 2 was based though. The music was a pretty banger, to the point I've heard it used in YouTube videos completely unrelated to FNAF. Apparently it's made by a guy named Leon Riskin. He would go on to do the same for Sister Location, and those tracks are really good. By the way, Sister Location, Five Nights at Freddy's again. FNAF Reloaded. This one has a subtitle. It's too cool for the number 5. Whose sister in what location? You can tell this is the best game in the series because it has even slightly more animations, but not many more. It's probably because of the garbage engine it's made on, but considering Scott was an animator, it's a shame there aren't more animations in this series, but that's whatever. What's more important is that this game sucks. Oh sorry, is that still a 5 million Kelvin take? Let me be more delicate and say, Sister Location ruined the franchise. Oh no, I did it again. I'm sorry, I have a condition that makes me say based things all the time. My beef with what was historically the fan favorite is twofold. The gameplay is bleh, and the story is blah. Though I'll first front load this section with compliments to create the illusion of balance by handing out some W's for the atmosphere. I like how this game utilizes silence. This game's approach to ambience, aesthetics, and general atmosphere is pretty different to the others. The soundscape uses the opposite approach from the first game. Instead of loading your ears with various random noises and droning background loops, the main sounds you'll hear when nothing is happening is this subtle ringing in your ears. Although why would you leave the flashlight on in here? Easily the most obviously different thing about Sissy Location has got to be sort of the pseudo 3D movement effect. I gotta hand it to Scott for creating a very immersive illusion of movement in a generally crappy engine that's restricted to 2 dimensions. It's done very simply, using an animated background that looks as if you're moving forward and your head is bobbing. And if you're moving towards something, the graphic of that thing will increase slowly in size as you walk. And it helps that the environment is very dark, so that very little is actually visible and it's easier to trick your brain. It's not exactly quadruple digit IQ stuff, but it's seamless and convincing. The gameplay is barely existent. It's essentially a collection of FNAF-themed point-and-click minigames, none of which you play more than once, so there's not really any gameplay loop per se, other than clicking a button, waiting out the overwritten dialogue giving enough time for the funny YouTubers to say funny things and do funny reactions, then clicking another button. Gameplay. What I dislike the most, I think, is the lack of agency. You go along very rigid rails, following the direction of narrator voices, with very little player interaction most of the time. The player has so little agency, you're not allowed to walk around and explore yourself. I think there are exactly only 2 branching paths in the game, and whenever you're told to go somewhere that's more than a single room away, it'll just teleport you, rather than letting you navigate the environment yourself. The first night even ends abruptly. You don't even get to exit the place yourself. It is so on rails. And why, on night 5, do I still need the narrator to tell me to push the buttons? Why can't I just do it myself?
Let's check on Ballora and make sure she's on her stage.
This simple routine has been tutorialized to me 4 times now, I got it. The minigames themselves are fine, one of them terrible, but others not. The Ballora one is neat in that it takes advantage of the limitations of the engine by having nearly only a black screen with just enough visuals to give the illusion of movement. For a section that is practically just a black screen with some sound effects and 1 button you have to press, it's pretty immersive, forcing you to be attentive and imagine where this supposed animatronic is. and it's good as a one and done since that could easily get old. Unless you die during the next Funtime Freddy minigame, in which case it outrageously forces you to go all the way back and redo the Belore one as well. Doing this section any more than once completely ruins the effect, I think, and it's annoying anyway. The Kellen Golf game is a bit more interaction intensive, where you're expected to click and hold several buttons for as long as you can at a time while Femboy Freddy prances around the room. You have to be very patient, only using the terminal when you see him on stage, and using the Bonnie voice only after he says a voice line. It's a decent section, pretty tense when holding these buttons, and the atmosphere is built well, with the only source of illumination in the environment is a few broken lights that flash one at a time, showing Freddy for a split second in different positions around the room. Shuffling sound effects play all over the place, even when he's clearly not moving. I don't even know what I'm doing. Is this a map? What are all these places? I can make sense of the middle section. That's the map of the facility that we get in the extras. But what are these appendages? Call me crazy, but these kind of remind me of... What? That doesn't even make sense. Stop it. The Funtime Foxy, by the way, Funtime is the designation of this particular squadron. The Funtime Foxy one does the same thing as the Belore one, but worse. It's actually just a black screen, but this time you flash some sort of flash device. Now you could have very effectively creepy imagery for this and have strange sounds to generate tension for each flash, but the creepiest imagery that happens is this, which is kind of funny actually. The tension comes from not knowing exactly if he's moving or where he is until you flash. But you have to move while in darkness and don't know where she is. So it was really hard for me to get a grasp on when to walk or not. You just have to be careful, I guess. Sounds don't seem to really mean anything. They don't tell you when he's there or where she is. Also, the fact you had to listen to the narrator guy every time you die is insane.
Funtime Foxy is motion activated. For this reason, it's important to keep the room dark as to not accidentally activate her. You have been provided with a flash beacon. Use it if you need to get anywhere and to ensure
I don't have much to say about the Freddy maintenance game. It's just clicking a few buttons as you're told, but I like how intimidating Freddy's aura can be, though his insides could be much creepier if they weren't so goofily unrealistic. Real-life animatronic insides look so unnerving. Why not try to take advantage of that, especially in a scene like this? Ooh, wait, here's an idea for a minigame. What if we had the player simulate being in a springlock suit? Hey, that's a cool idea. And the best way to execute that is as a tedious test of patience where you just click a bunch of tiny buttons just barely fast enough to not die. I still have a chip on my shoulder from all the way back in 2016 when Night 4 was straight up impossible. I played that bullshit for 8 hours straight to beat it pre-patch. But this game is still really annoying. You just click and hold like 20 different buttons for as long as possible to try and keep them from playing their entire animation. This is technically anxiety inducing, but the interaction itself is so tedious. The best part about it is these creepy little shits climbing the sides of your screen and inside the suit like the spiders that climb in your mouth while you're sleeping. And Belora's half-illuminated broken face staring at you the whole time is a cool visual. Honestly, these Uncanny Valley personifications were probably the most I had genuinely been creeped out by any of these games at that point. But god, this night still absolutely sucks. It doesn't matter how good you are at keeping the things wound, as they'll increase in speed to the point they'll inevitably get close to failing at a certain point. The constant clicking sounds don't make it any less annoying. And dying from the spring locks is poorly communicated. When you fail to click these buttons fast enough, you just get jump scared by this fucker. Why does an art mannequin yell at you when you get spring locked? Why not make an animation of you actually getting spring locked? That could potentially be rad. The exact same jump scare plays if you let one of the creepy fucks climb too high on the sides of your face. There's no distinction between these two death scenarios, and so I can imagine someone getting very confused as to why they died. Obviously, the idea of the spring locks being controlled by several tiny buttons on the sides of the inside of the mask, where nobody would be able to reach inside with their hands. There's no way to conceptualize what the hell is supposed to be going on here in universe. What was really anticlimactic for me when I played it for the first time was everything after Night 4. Not only because that sudden spike in difficulty had no chance of being followed up by anything satisfying, but also after that story scenario your character was in.
having been kidnapped and trapped in a spring lock suit in some dark place in the facility. I was expecting things to ramp up from there, like some climax that would pay off this apparent rising tension, only for your character to somehow make it back home at the end of the night, and the next night, outside of the cool hangman roleplayers. The rest of the game after that goes back to the more subtle, lo-fi atmosphere of the first 3 nights. I don't know if anyone can relate, but I remember the tension feeling really deflated after night 4. But to be fair, I don't know what could have possibly felt worth it after that mess. The last kind of minigame thing is the secret Five Nights at Ennard's fan game hidden inside this game. Oh, finally we've gotten to the Five Nights at Freddy's game inside this game. There was a lot of padding this time. The mechanics are solid, but it's very tight to the point you can barely even interact with the game. You have just a hair above enough power to start, so you're forced to do little else but sit and listen to where he's walking, and very occasionally, very quickly, popping up the cameras to look at him. So, same problem as most FNAF games. You're not allowed to look at the cameras, which are part of the point of the series, making for kind of boring gameplay and frustrating when you lose, only getting interesting at the very end when it suddenly gets very fast. I like the voices you hear throughout the night, and I'm not even going crazy this time.
Isn't this why you came here? To be with her again?
It's apparently Baby nagging you to let them inside you, continuing to imply she's not the girl who died. But because this game philosophically disagrees with the concept of checkpoints, if you lose, you have to go through all the dialogue and story stuff of the night before you can get back to the Easter egg room to try again. I don't have anything against most of these minigames individually, but you only ever play each one of them once. Even the ones that repeat don't actually repeat. In a game, you have your core thing that you do, which you repeat autistically as you get better, and it accordingly gets more difficult. This is what we elites in the insider game design secret societies call a gameplay loop, cause it's like gameplay and you loop it. But it isn't looped. Each of these minigames aren't repeated, so you never get good at it, except when you get yelled at by silly cartoons and you have to replay it, which rips the atmosphere. There isn't a core loop throughout the entire game. It's awkward is all, and it lacks the natural satisfaction of figuring shit out baked into all games. I think this is a bad thing. This thing was obviously designed with the story at the forefront, and any actual gameplay took a backseat. So that being said, what about the story? Was the story so interesting that it had to completely replace the gameplay? You'd certainly hope so, since it forces you to sit and listen to so much of it. The lore bits this game introduced makes me want to take an autism test for ever being invested in this franchise. Let me get this straight. There's a rent-a-clown animatronic factory, or a sexy animatronic factory, several stories underground, ran by a serial child murderer who made robots with conveniently convincing AI for whenever this takes place, built for the express purpose of voring children to presumably extract their soul juice. And then they lure you into something called the Scooper, which is the totally non-destructive way the company extracts their robot spaghetti. You know, robot spaghetti. The way robots' insides are designed. Except you get your human spaghetti extracted from your exoskeleton so that their spaghetti orgy can climb into yours to become a totally non-sus imposter among us until you turn Orpal. Then you throw up the robo noodles, and then they come alive, and then you come back alive, and then the end. Try theorizing this shit, retards. There's nowhere to even begin with this. How about their robot spaghetti? What is this? Who in what era makes robots this way? Who builds a spaceship underground without doorways for no reason? Why is there caution tape all around the entrance as if this place is a crime scene or condemned or something? It's not, apparently.
There are still 2 technicians on site today.
Why does it have to be connected to the FNAF 4 house, man? There's definitely 100% no way this takes place anywhere near the other games, right? What year does this take place? What year could this possibly take place in? Why he Orpal? Why am I horny? Why he Orpal? Okay, so let me get you up to speed real quick. The killer, the purple guy, is now named
Mr. Afton.
tells you a lot about the franchise that it took until the 5th main installment to get the name of the main villain. Apparently, outside of his main career of killing children, he works part-time as an owner of a robotics company, responsible for the creation of these animatronics. Of course, implying he could have very well been involved with running Freddy's at some point, which, if that's the case, immediately brings into question why he would commit obvious extreme crimes directly tied to the company. But you can forget about that question because it's never going to be answered, at least not by anything outside of the imaginations of the fan base. This guy is not the purple guy, nor William Afton, supposedly. Instead, some other character named Michael, introduced in this cutscene. I'll restrain myself from ranting about this cutscene for now, but vibe-wise, that cutscene kinda fucks. And the idea of possessing your own rotting corpse is a pretty rad concept. I want him to teach me how to do that. Too bad it came out of fucking nowhere and was only represented in a low-res style cutscene. Other than that, I think my overall feelings on this story is... It was always really disappointing to me how this game explicitly references the famous question of, why does the protagonist come back every night?
I'm curious what events would lead a person to want to spend their nights in a place like this, willingly.
Only to never give a straight answer. I know there is one, if you read between the bajillion vague and goofy lines, but since the game calls it out in such an explicit manner in the very beginning, I was kinda hoping for a direct and explicit answer. So, if you're not already a FNAF-pilled Faz-cell and don't know the story, Baby is the name of this clown baby animatronic, which is secretly designed to lure children and then extend its giant claw out of its stomach to imprison and presumably slowly digest the victim over the course of 1,000 years. Again, leave your suspension of disbelief at the door from here on out. This series will no longer care for it.
There are just certain design choices that were made for these robots that we don't fully understand. We were hoping that you could shed some light on those.
By the way, I like how these blueprints were made by just rendering the models' wireframes, and it don't really make sense as blueprint drawings. Like, how is this dense mess of lines useful as a blueprint? Baby herself explains this backstory and perplexingly to me, describes it as if she's not the spirit of the child that was killed.
Did you know that I was on stage once? It wasn't for very long. Only one day, a little girl, standing by herself. I was no longer myself, and I stopped singing. There was screaming for a moment, but only for a moment.
As if this is actually the robot AI talking, which would be a way too advanced technology for any time period this would believably be set in, and is a left field asshole anyway. This series had been operating on the logic that ghost kids control animatronics as a core principle forever. But then Mr. FNAF 6-Man says they have spirits inside them.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Elizabeth. If you still even remember that name.
So if this is the child's ghost talking, how does she know what it was like to kill herself from the robot's POV?
Give up your spirits. They don't belong to you.
Also, what spirits haunt the rest of these guys? I don't think this game ever explains that. Whom's spirits be entrapped unto thine mechanic clowns? Also, why do you have to crawl into the hidey place for a baby to start talking to you? It has recently come to my attention that a popular theory for this is that the original victims' souls were extracted from the old animatronics into the fun times as an experiment by Afton, which is what Purple Guy disassembling them in the FNAF 3 cutscenes would supposedly be. But that's hard to swallow since we see those ghosts in the climactic Springtrap scene after the disassembling, and the whole theme of that game is that those spirits move on and are able to finally rest in some sort of afterlife. I'm willing to acknowledge this as yet another potential huge retcon, since I do see this as one of the only ways to explain the fun times' apparent possession, but it completely damages that FNAF 3 cutscene, and by extension that entire game story. Which would really suck because that's like the only thing I like about that game. I really like the idea of the kids getting their revenge on the killer and well-deserved post-mortem rest after so long, but I do realize we're far removed from that at this point in the lore. The second possibility is possibly cleaner, but arguably less narratively satisfying, that the fun times are possessed by random, nameless, faceless victims of the luring and trapping mechanisms built inside these robots, and we just never get to see that or have that confirmed anywhere for some non-existent reason. This also sucks, but is less damaging. There's a part later where Baby is ordering you around like the simp you are, and not to spoil it all over you, but Baby is actually everybody. They all combine together to become the Giga Spaghetti monster known as Ennard. So like a literal they-them. See him standing back there? Kinda creepy actually. The whole idea is that they want to wear your skin. Understandable. But then if you fuck up in any of these scenes, Ennard will just jump scare you. But he supposedly needs you to get scooped, to climb inside your skin.
We need you, so that we can look like you.
Why would he kill you just for typing a keypad wrong? And if he could kill you and then scoop your body afterward, then why not just skip to that part? It's obviously because there needed to be some punishment for failing the thinly veiled minigame, and that obviously had to be a jump scare. No, just more unnecessary jump scares, making me look dumb and stupid for defending them earlier. And these animations aren't even approaching intimidating. Fucking googly-eyed noodle man. Ennard's positioning behind the scooper gives off the vibe of intent. Taking it at face value, if Baby isn't in Ennard yet, and that's why Ennard, referred to as Ballora at this point, doesn't cooperate with Baby before the scooper room.
Ballora is going to follow you. She will try to catch you. I will help you avoid her.
Then what is Ennard, with the mask standing behind the scooper, meant to signify if not to execute the plan to scoop you? In this interpretation, that seems to be exclusively Baby's plan, since Ennard wasn't cooperating. I guess the babyless Ennard was just watching from the sidelines, somehow teleporting from in front of the scooper room door when blocking you, to behind the scooper here in a couple of seconds, as a confused bystander to what is specifically Baby's plan. If Baby is already inside Ennard, like I think most fans assume, then what was the whole deal with Ballora/Ennard not cooperating with Baby?
He is here to help, Ballora. He is not here to hurt us. Ballora, he is here to help us.
That's a very weirdly specific and unnecessary thing to just fake and act out. And again, why would he ever kill you? And what is with that chip thing? And since the Baby animatronic clearly still has an endoskeleton inside her, then how is Baby inside Ennard exactly? The way Night 5 is presented never quite made sense to me, with the idea that Baby is already inside Ennard and she's just pretending or whatever. The rest of them really can't be involved in Baby's plan to scoop you, considering how Ennard behaves. But then why did everyone else combine into Ennard in the first place then? It also confuses me how the mask disappears in the beginning of Night 5, but Ennard doesn't start wearing it until the very end. You can still get a general gist of what's supposed to be going on, but it's weird. And my suspension of disbelief was not prepared to deal with this surreal craziness. In the Five Nights at Ennard's office, there's yet another Easter egg where if you press the numbers 1983 on a keypad, it'll activate monitors that show what looks like security camera footage of the FNAF 4 house. What? Worse yet is the presence of the Fredbear plush from that game with a walkie-talkie next to it. Am I supposed to interpret this as whoever works here, likely William Afton, has security cameras in this house, likely his house, which is also somehow connected to this facility, and what exactly is that supposed to suggest that isn't insane? The assumption many have had is that the imaginary friend plushie from 4 was actually Afton talking through this walkie-talkie to who would theoretically be his son. This, I find, fucking silly, especially since nothing the plush said necessarily sounded like what Afton would say to the kid. It sounds mostly like the kid's conscience, or something that figuratively represents it, like an imaginary friend sort of deal. And the only time anyone potentially spoke through the plushie was at the very end, which is easy to conceptualize as someone beside his hospital bed whose voice is being filtered into his comatose streams. I see that as a far cleaner interpretation compared to now needing a motivation for why Afton would do this. An explanation that doesn't technically exist anywhere in corporeal space.
A prominent theory nowadays, because of this bullshit, is that FNAF 4 is now real. Not nightmares of a traumatized kid or any of that cool, creepy story. Fuck that, we can't have nice things, so instead, FNAF 4 is actually real-life experiments, or torture sessions, or who knows what by Afton, who made these spooky robots to fuck with probably Michael. This interpretation, despite sounding completely stupid, unfortunately has some evidence towards it, since this map shows the locations in the FNAF 4 gameplay to be not only real-life locations, but they're shown to be connected to the sister location bunker, and shows the minigame and gameplay versions of the FNAF 4 house to be separate locations. There's also these gray dots, which seem to represent animatronics. They also probably have illusion discs or nightmare gas or something, which creates a spooky hallucination on top of what is actually a bare endoskeleton, like the endoskeletons inside all of the nightmare animatronics. So it kinda makes sense, except for when Foxy turns into a plushie, but please forget about that. If true, this is the most annoying thing ever. You can't convince me that was Scott's original intention when he made FNAF 4. This idea is nowhere inside that game, and it is quite a ridiculous hardcore retcon, changing what was easily explained as the nightmares of a traumatized kid into now an elaborate saw contraption that would require way too many resources and is way too hyper-specific to make any damn sense for someone to actually construct. And why? Because Mike was a naughty boy and this is Afton's punishment? What, didn't have a belt handy? How much did this cost? Where could this possibly be located? How, why, and how many times did he put Mike in and out of this thing? I don't think I'm being unreasonable, considering these games up to this point had gotten me used to a completely different kind of story. But these are a lot more fantastical elements that I have to suspend my disbelief for than I was expecting, to the point where I refuse. If this is the intended story, I'm leaving that disbelief unsuspended. I just think this is too ridiculous. And it completely fundamentally changes a story that I liked. Fuck. And by the way, this is definitely a brain inside the big black man. I don't want to hear none of y'all trying to tell me it's an endoskeleton head. I ain't never seen no endoskeleton that looked so round and lumpy and also not connected to any other mechanical devices. I'm calling bullshit. It's a reflection of the brain you're playing inside of. Bro is definitely a symbolic manifestation of the nightmares of a traumatized kid. Not to mention I don't know why Afton would do all this. I can guess, but I don't want to have to guess to explain something so out of left field.
William Afton is weird. We rarely get to hear from him. I think the only time he ever says anything directly is in the beginning of this game, and a couple lines in FNAF 6. But what we do see of him is mostly that of an archetypal malevolent villain, and the serial murderer of children, as well as the constructor of abduction bots. But then he's also the father of 3, and now he's supposedly sending comforting words through the persona of a plushie via a radio to his distressed son. These pieces, void of any speculation, are abject nonsense. Afton's character is discombobulated. It desperately needs extra explanation to connect all these disparate pieces. But explanations can only be extrapolated through a lot of reading between the lines, i.e. writing the story for Scott. It's crazy that despite all the fucking talking in this game, we never get any direct explanation for the motivations of the guy that is supposedly the main villain of the series, that this game is partly the formal introduction of. I know fans are pretty familiar with Willie at this point, but it's easy to forget a lot of what we think we know is technically just theories. And that's the problem I'm having. I find it frustrating that we have to interpret the villain's motivation, because it's just a far less satisfying story that way, since I can't be sure that any particular fan theory is even right, let alone run with it as an explanation for all these disparate things this character supposedly does. As if I know this character, but I don't know this character. Nobody does. This isn't a character. Every single time you hear motivations attributed to Afton in fan theories, it's pure speculation. It's not in the games. That wouldn't even be so bad if there just weren't so many things to explain. It wasn't a problem in the beginning to not directly explain things because the story was so simple. It was mostly pretty straightforward and intuitive, and there just weren't that many pieces to make sense of, so it could rely on the audience inferring stuff, especially relating to the killer. He was a crazed serial killer because he was just a crazed serial killer. There's a lot of those in the world. It's a pretty easy assumption to make. Now it's he's a crazed serial killer, and he builds child-capturing cartoon mascots, and he spies on his son because... So the main fan theory is this. After the death of his son at the hands of his own creation, he presumably, at some point, noticed his son's spirit possessing Fredbear maybe, or some mysterious other thing that encouraged him to start research and development into technology that extracts the soul juices of people, called Remnant, something from the books that appears to be vaguely referenced in an Easter egg in the games. So he takes the lives of children specifically for some reason, as an experiment to find the best ways to entrap someone's soul after death, supposedly to one day have the technology to rebuild his son. Yeah, if this sounds far beyond out of the leftist of fields, it is. All of this relies on heavy assumptions based on cross-referencing the games and books which have canonical discrepancies, and just making things up. It's not super satisfying to me to have to rely so heavily on assumptions informed by extracurricular material with questionable canonicity. If this is the story, I'd kinda like it to actually be shown to me in the games, at least mostly. But Willie's not the only pixelated sprite retconned into something approximating a character in this game. So too is this Michael guy.
Father, it's me, Michael.
Suspected by most to be the Foxy Bro from the 4th game.
I did it. I found her. I put her back together, just like you asked me to.
I guess this is supposed to establish Afton's MO of instructing his kids to do weird shit, because that's apparently what your main character is doing in this game.
It's me, Michael.
Okay, not only is the killer not just some crazed killer, not only is he a father who also kills children for some still unstated reason, not only is he also the creator of the animatronics, but now he's instructing his son to go out and do stuff with these robots for some reason. The plot is confusing.
I put her back together.
You know, it's not like the more you repeat that phrase, the more I'll understand what it means. That's not how that works. Also, this scene was super confusing when it first came out because of how the voice is played over footage of Springtrap, and it kinda sounds like it has a reverb to it.
I'm going to come find you. I'm going to come find you.
So the natural assumption everyone had was that this voice came from Springtrap, which would imply William isn't Springtrap, but this new Michael guy is, thereby completely throwing the community into chaos, to the point Scott even had to say something. This is a funny example of why this series is so frustrating a lot of the time. All of this spurging is just to express how I think this might be a tad bit, a little sort of, slightly kind of jumping the shark moment for me. Just for me, okay? It's okay if you like it. Idiot. Not only does it come with the consistent motif of indecipherable vagary that's increasingly becoming a series staple, but the stuff you can understand is simply goofy. Of course, the idea of ghost children possessing robots is unrealistic, as far as we know, but the idea of ghosts in general is ancient, and so is easy for most people to accept for the sake of fiction. The idea of ghosts seeking revenge is also common, and ghosts possessing objects is similarly simple. There ain't much in the first 4 games that strays too far from typical horror story tropes, and felt relatively grounded in tone. Only for Sister Location to vomit up a haunted spaghetti of pseudo-sci-fi silliness onto my unsuspecting, obsessively invested face. I don't think I was the only one who got overwhelmed. It's no wonder many people decided to climb out of their game theorist padded cell and off their computer to try not to think about how none of this makes any sense and why Scott Cawthon keeps making his scary kids robots sexy. I think it's generally recognized by now that Sister Location was a soft reboot, especially with Scott basically saying as much.
It had strayed too far from an actual story in a way. Me just saying that, I'm going to get torn apart for even saying that, because people are going to look at what I've ended up with. They're going to be like, and you call this a story? And then after the reaction of it, I was like, I need to craft this into something better for the people who see this as important.
There was a drastic tonal shift. It went from a relatively grounded ghost story that felt like it could potentially happen in real life, and it felt morbid because of that, but then became very fantastical. Like, a dilapidated pizzeria with haunted animatronics is way easier to accept than a high-tech underground facility storing rentable AI robots that are secretly designed to kidnap children and extract their soul essence. It became a completely different story, one that I just don't like as much, and I think it was misguided to abruptly change the story so much, and especially with the way it was presented, using elements from the books, which were previously stated to be definitively non-canon, not giving enough information in the game itself to even explain who William Afton is, and topping it all off with showing a literal purple guy who is actually supposed to be a different character than the previously established purple guy. Insane. This was such a confusing time to be a FNAF fan, to the point I started subconsciously checking out. I still followed this series for a while, so I'm kind of lying, but only with the vain hope of finding something that makes everything make sense, not so much for the sake of the games or story themselves. And I had completely given up on theorizing myself. When I did try that with Sister Location, I only got frustrated and confused. The basic elements of the plot were making no sense to me. If this game was meant to contort the series into a more conventional and satisfying narrative, I don't think this did a very good job of that. I appreciate the attempt to make something a bit more ambitious for the yet another if entry in the series. At that point, you absolutely have to shake things up. The animations were nice, this fake 3D stuff was clever, and the atmosphere was alright and stands out as unique among the series, but that's not enough to make up for the everything else, unfortunately.
I don't even think that I want there to be any more Five Nights at Freddy's after this.
FNAF 6? What's next? FNAF 6 2? I can't take this anymore. Don't worry, you're almost at the end of the video. This video, at least. So suck it up. For this one, he gave the whole teaser thing a rest. He straight up didn't promote this game. An interesting approach. Apparently, he was one guide into thinking if he did, people would get fatigued by that point. Probably right. Unfortunately, I don't get to take a break from talking about this crap. So, he went into hiding for a year, pretending like he wasn't making FNAF 6, all the while making FNAF 6, only ever cheekily throwing out the idea of a simple spin-off tycoon game. And then just dropped a game onto Steam that looked like this. Joke's on you, it was a tycoon game and FNAF 6. He even made it free, which is extremely respectable. That out of the way, I don't have as much nice to say about the game, of course. Look, what if I just enjoy being a mean asshole, okay? You gonna take that away from me? This whole introductory section is pretty great. It does this cute thing where, at first, it acts like it's nothing more than some Chinese mobile game looking ass, then it tweaks out, and then hard cuts to this. Real good first impression. This visual, the composition, the lighting and everything, is pretty beautiful. Alas, in trying to be both a tycoon and FNAF game, it does neither very well. The tycoon parts are really bare bones, to the point it's little more than a facade. You're given a decent selection of items to choose from, but very limited options in how to place them. Customization is not the aim of this game, so nearly every person's pizzeria will end up looking the same. The most value the tycoon parts bring is as a break from the traditional FNAF sections. I like the stylistic direction of this game too. Each of these games has a distinctive vibe from the other, and so too does this one. I like the design of Squid Freddy, commonly referred to as Molten Freddy because I don't know why. Supposedly, he's supposed to be Ennard, post-baby. She got voted out and ejected from the crew off-screen for being a baka. The Robo Noodles are retconned to have realistic thickness now. I still don't know why he's only noodles, but who cares anymore. He's also no longer Joker-pilled, and Funtime Freddy has been defemboyed. Baby 2, as well, has received physical trauma over the course of who knows how long between these games, as well as having magicked her body back together, and gave herself individual strands of hair from somewhere.
It's weird to me that after being so desperate to escape, having to become a skinwalker to do so, that Ennard and Baby would both individually go back to the sister location Fallout bunker to rebuild their faces. I can appreciate their passion for aesthetics though. These rare screens are all really cool. I think this baby, Scrap Baby, is the coolest design in the series, outside of the marionette, even though it's kinda noisy. Ah! Who the fuck Lefty, that's this guy's name, fucking liberal, is just an edgy Freddy. He's black now, so he can say it. Other than that, there's not much going on there. The only interesting thing about him is that he's actually the marionette, and the marionette is actually a she.
My daughter, I'm sorry that on that day, the day you were shut out and left to die.
Oops. After literally decades of making games, Scott finally figured out how to achieve 1080p resolution. He finally did it. At the end of the series, we've come so far. No, seriously, yeah. All of the rest of these games have been technically less than full HD quality. These visuals are the minority in the game though. Vibe-wise, this is the least horror of any of the original 6 games. It's extremely tongue-in-cheek, and I have no idea what that expression means. The atmosphere of the salvage section is, I like the freakish demon noise Henry makes from inside his cassette tape. Henry is the guy stuck inside the tape player. That sound, alongside these visuals, goes pretty crazy. The office sections... Why are we in a vent? Literal wage cage. The gameplay here is unique in that, for the first time in the series, you're supposed to actually do something while on the job. You have to try and do all these task things before you leave. So, completing the night is dependent on your actions rather than a timer. The atmosphere of this part is kind of thin. Like most of the FNAF sequels, the audio should have had more going on, especially since the core mechanic of the gameplay is just clicking a button and waiting for a thing to load over and over again. The single consistent monotone drone in the background doesn't help the dry, monotonous feeling of this. The salvage sections give you a choice to either smash the animatronic, not like that, into parts to be reused, this is a lie, or pass them back into the alley, where you found them, I guess. With each one you accept, it becomes an enemy you have to deal with in the vents. And of course you're supposed to take all of them to get the real ending. Fuck that though, because it becomes a bitch to manage all those guys, with your only defense being a single questionably functional audio lure, and just staring at the vents you think they might be coming through, all the while doing the tasks. And you can't do the motion sensor or audio lure while doing the tasks. I just had a hard time with this, honestly. And I had an even harder time caring enough to get good. The last cinematic minigame I'll be talking about is the most controversial in the series, known as Midnight Motorist, as it's technically an Easter egg hidden inside the Midnight Motorist arcade game. It's most well known for having a fat fucking BGM. That's fat with a PH, by the way, which is millennial speak for cool, okay? I'm saying I like it. But who is this motorist and why is he motoring at midnight? Well, the theory goes that this is William Afton, Golden William Afton, because of course it is. Supposedly right after doing this murder. So assumed based on the weather and the name of the scene in the engine. We know he's William because who the fuck else would it be? I can only guess that the color is different because the purple guy was only ever purple in order to represent a shadowy figure on top of an already black background. But now he's no longer in the shadows, in fact we're playing as him. And I think Scott was trying to draw a connection between William and the yellow color of Spring Bonnie. Honestly, I'd rather completely forget about the Yellow Man minigame. It's completely useless, as far as I can tell. It only ends up confusing you. I've racked my brain about it, and it's not a very powerful brain, but the way I see it, this minigame could mean literally anything. The guy could be William, and the missing kid could be Michael running off to Freddy's after seeing Golden Freddy outside his window, and this is showing the beginning of Michael's journey to find out what's happening. Although it wouldn't make much sense for Golden Freddy to be able to so much as stand up, much less walk around outside, then back, but that's the only explanation I can give to the bear tracks, at least if the yellow guy is William.
Or the kid could be crying child, because who else would this gray figure be but Michael? The yellow guy could be Henry, and this is showing some random moment in his life and a son he's never talked about for some reason, I don't know. Or it could be some random father of a child who was lured out of the home by William in the spring Bonnie suit. Junior's, I feel like, is definitely just a pub, since this feels like a weird way to represent a Freddy's location. The flashing neon sign and small brown building gives off heavy pub vibes to me. But then, why show this? Just to say this random yellow man is an alcoholic, as if there isn't already enough to characterize him as a bad father. But if it's a Freddy's location, why the fuck call it Junior's? That'd be so needlessly weird and confusing. And there's not a single good explanation I can give to the random patch of dirt. Just fuck this shit. I can't see how any one of these interpretations would even be necessary to show. Any way you look at it, it seems redundant, showing us events we already knew or could have already inferred. So that's why I'd rather just forget about it. This game inherits the same problem from Sister Location for me, in that I don't understand who the fuck the spirits inside Molten Freddy are supposed to be. In case you forgot, because I've said too many fucking words already, even I'm losing track, the current theory is that the original 5 kids are inside this guy. Don't think about it and it'll make sense. So the idea of this game is to bring every character in one place to burn them all and end this mess of a story already. Although I thought we already did that. I guess it just didn't work. So why would it work now? I don't think I like the portrayal of baby's spirits in this game, apparently now named Elizabeth.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Elizabeth.
Weird lore drop, but okay.
You played right into our hands. Now we can do what we were created to do. I will make you proud, Daddy.
She was killed by Afton's murderbot when she was like 5 or something, got trapped inside said robot for the intermediary who knows how many years, and that somehow led to her now wanting to follow in her father's footsteps to, I don't know, kill people? What does William even want anymore? And by extension, what would Elizabeth even think he wants her to do? I don't think it logically follows that a spirit with enough memory to know Afton is her father would be anything other than angry at her father for making the thing that killed her, or at the very least wouldn't want to become an evil cartoon villain for his sake. Portraying the lost soul of a murdered child as a one-dimensional villain for the sake of it is abysmally lame to me. Like what? Did she get the evil gene from her father? But it's recessive, that's why Michael didn't get it?
I will make you proud, Daddy.
Ugh, it's just cringe. Henry's role isn't explained in the game. He technically functions as a nameless voice on a tape recorder to explain what you need to do, but it'd be nice to know who the heck he was and why he's here. The game doesn't tell you, it only infers it by referencing the name of the character in the books, who you can assume shares the same general characteristics, but we don't know. It is not good to have to refer to material outside of the game in a different medium to understand the game. It should stand on its own, otherwise that means it's technically incomplete, or even dysfunctional. Also, where is he? Why can't he do this shit? Now, the ending. It's a cool ending, but it shouldn't be the ending. There already was a better ending, and FNAF 3 being canon within this ending inherently makes this make less sense. As a second ending, it's about as good as you could expect, but unfortunate that it even exists. At least with these characters. Springtrap didn't have to always come back, and the marionette didn't have to be dragged back into relevance. And if Molten Freddy really is the combined spirits of the original missing children, then that makes this even worse, as that would have retconned their ending only to redo it here, squished together into just one of several characters getting their send-off all at once. Sister Location could have been a new start with new characters, but this series is allergic to branching too far off from the same goddamn characters. The game doesn't super suck, but I don't really come back to this one. All good stories must come to an end. Any story needs to come to an end, in fact. And while the FNAF series was dragging its feet in giving an official ending for some years, with Scott's unwillingness to leave it at each entry after FNAF 3 for one reason or another, it really seemed after FNAF 6 and Ultimate Custom Night that the main series of games, and by extension the story, had finally come to another close. A lot of loose ends were wrapped up, and while many aspects of the story remained a mystery, many of the most important through lines were given an overall closure. Most of the spirits haunting the animatronics were given rest, and released in the fire in FNAF 3, and the remaining few wandering around after that had followed at the end of FNAF 6. Most people had a general vague understanding of the plot and timeline, and there were no more spirits to haunt any robots for any reason. This was definitely the end, right? Oh god, we're not done? Yet another FNAF game. Alright, what is the— holy shit. You know, I just realized FNAF is basically just Osu, but horror. I will not explain myself. This next one isn't horror though. Like actually this time. It's basically build your own FNAF game. Choose your own flavor of torture/cancer. It's basically the Dark Souls of Five Nights at. The appeal of this one is just to get the highest score you can by beating as many characters at once as probable. It's quite a migraine, and consequently, it's the most fun FNAF game for me. It's not my favorite, the other games have different kinds of appeal, but this one has the most engaging gameplay. The max difficulties in these games have always been a test to see how far you can push your reflexes, attention, and endurance. And this game just extends that, utilizing basically as many different mechanics as possible, and a long path with many different thresholds. It's the natural evolution of FNAF's bullshit. I really like it. It's a shame the mechanics for the characters don't always align with their original mechanics though. I don't know why, but whatever. But believe it or not, this is not actually all of the characters in the franchise. I don't know where Withered Freddy is, or Nightmare Foxy, but thank God we have Nightmare Mangle. I guess it'd be redundant, but we sure as shit need Balloon Boy 2. I don't actually care, it's just weird. Even more weird, in initial promo images, there was Candy Cadet and the chibi endoskeleton from FNAF World, as well as the Freddles themselves, were listed as separate characters that would appear in the game. This one's not trying at all to be scary. It entirely focuses on the gameplay, and looking at it from that angle, as a fun fanservice-y spin-off, it's pretty good if you like FNAF's core mechanics. I know I did a lot of saying mean things for no reason, and also a lot of taking the teddy bear jump scare game too seriously. But me finding things to make fun of or criticize in something doesn't necessarily mean I think the whole thing is overall worthless. You can like something perfectly fine while still making fun of or criticizing it. Even though I have a hard time saying I like the series per se, my nostalgia won't allow me to say I hate it either. I am a closeted FNAF fan after all. What FNAF fan doesn't have a bajillion different criticisms of the series? I just have too many opinions about this that I've built up over the years that I want to let out. And if you disagree with them, that's fine. I disagree with yours too, so we're even. And I don't have anything against Scott Cawthon, despite parasocially throwing his name around so flippantly. Even if I don't like a lot of the stuff in the later games, they're still just games. It's not like it matters, ultimately.
Just stuck in defend. After all, you only got 5 nights at Freddy's. Is this where you wanna be? I just don't get it. Why do you wanna stay 5 nights at Freddy's?